Joseph Lister, Part 1. Mother Nature is a murderous hag. If you've watched any of the 10,000 seasons of Grey's Anatomy, then you'll know that modern surgeons are the rock stars of medicine. But back in the 19th century, surgeons were the embarrassing, gross little brothers of medicine. In fact, according to Lindsay Fitzharris's book, The Butchering Art, surgeons were known for being, well, butchers. This was because before the 1840s, surgical anesthesia didn't exist. In other words, no one gave you any painkillers before they started cutting. The luckiest patients passed right out. The rest had to go through the whole ordeal wide awake and screaming. For that reason, the good surgeons were giant men who could hold down a struggling patient and complete a surgery as quickly as possible, hopefully in seconds, not minutes. Under these conditions, even the best surgeons often screwed up. Seriously, one of the most respected surgeons of the 1830s accidentally removed a patient's testicle during a leg amputation. And that was a guy who was good at his job. So anyway, there were two major issues holding surgeons back before the 20th century. The first was obviously anesthesia. You just couldn't perform that many surgeries without any pain control. After all, even Rambo wouldn't be able to hold still long enough for open heart surgery. Not without morphine, anyway. So as long as there was no real pain control, anything more complicated than amputation was out of the question. The second, less obvious problem was cleanliness. Even if you survived your horrible appointment with the surgeon, there was still a strong chance that you die from sepsis, blood poisoning, before your wounds healed. The first issue, anesthesia, was tackled during the 1840s. During that decade, surgeons discovered that they could knock patients out using the chemical ether. However, this discovery created another problem. Since surgeons could now put patients under, they were willing to perform more surgeries. And more surgeries equaled more sepsis, and therefore more death. Enter Joseph Lister. Joseph Lister got his surgical degree in London and then moved over to Scotland to work in its hospitals, which, like every other hospital in the Western world at the time, were disgusting. To put this in perspective, most surgeons didn't clean their blades between surgeries. The hospital staff's idea of cleaning the wards was to sweep maybe once a week. Some doctors never washed their surgical gowns and would hand them over, crusted with God knows what, to beloved students, who never washed them either. The general putrescence of hospitals was so well known that surgeons used to speak of good old hospital stink. Barf. Joseph Lister was not actually the first surgeon to realize that all this filth was bad for patients. In the 1840s, a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis had caught on to the dangers of dirt because of something called childbed fever. Childbed fever was an infection that set in after childbirth. It killed the new mother within days. It was a major problem in hospitals during the 1800s, but Semmelweis realized that it was caused by the dirty hands of doctors. In the case of Semmelweis's hospital, doctors were going straight from the morgue to the maternity ward, and were touching laboring mothers with the same hands that had just autopsied a corpse. Ew! Semmelweis had the doctors at his hospital wash their hands in bleach water between corpses and patients, which solved the problem. So why are we talking about Lister and not Semmelweis? Well, Semmelweis got a lot of pushback, as innovators often do, and he didn't handle the pressure well. He ended his life in an insane asylum, which is a bummer. Lister, like Semmelweis, was concerned by the huge numbers of patients who died in hospitals. From the very beginning of his career, he tried to figure out why, which meant that in his spare time, he did horrible experiments on frogs. As he gained experience as a doctor and kept torturing those poor frogs, Lister noticed the importance of keeping wounds clean. But it wasn't until he read the work of Louis Pasteur that he understood why. Joseph Lister, Part 2. Saving the World, one hand-washing station at a time. Before Louis Pasteur did his pioneering work on bacteria, doctors honestly had no idea how diseases were transmitted. Some thought they were spread through bad air. Others believed that illness just poofed into existence out of nowhere. But Pasteur showed that illnesses were caused by bacteria, little organisms that snuck inside our bodies and then wrecked everything they could get their tentacles on. Armed with this new theory, Lister realized he needed to make serious changes. He had always instinctively known that it was important to keep the wound clean. Now he realized that basic hygiene wasn't enough. He also needed to disinfect the wound somehow. Lister experimented with a bunch of disinfectants until he finally settled on something called carbolic acid. Because he now knew that bacteria were lurking all around, Lister would clean the patient's skin with carbolic acid before the surgery, and then keep applying it to the wound in the days after. Lister also made sure to clean his surgical instruments with carbolic acid both before and after surgeries. Thanks to these efforts, more and more of his patients began surviving. I know that all of this sounds like a big, fat duh, but before Lister, it wasn't. Even after Lister, it wasn't. Like Semmelweis, Lister ran into a lot of resistance. He published his findings in well-respected medical journals and encouraged other doctors to copy them. But a lot of surgeons pushed back against germ theory itself, and many surgeons who did try Lister's techniques complained that they didn't work, to which Lister replied that obviously if your filthy butt skipped a single step, then the whole thing came apart. I mean, it was true, but it sounded like BS. Lister had a lot of naysayers, but he just kept plugging away, writing articles, giving lectures in both Europe and the United States, and, most importantly, teaching. As important as Lister's hard work was, his students were actually a huge part of his success. Lister had facts on his side, and he managed to persuade quite a few people, but there were some who just weren't going to be convinced, no matter what. By being a teacher, Lister leapfrogged over these people. His students saw that his methods worked, and they took those methods with them as they became surgeons themselves. Eventually, Lister's students replaced the surgeons who refused to clean up their acts. So the next time that you, or someone you love, needs surgery, thank Joseph Lister, and his students too.